You probably think you know why you wake up every morning and drag yourself into the world of work, but there's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when your body realizes something your mind refuses to admit. Your work is shaping you far more than you're shaping it. Neuroscientists have been studying this phenomenon for years, tracing the way repetitive tasks alter the brain's default mode network, the place where meaning is born and identity is sculpted. And here's where Steiner whispers from the shadowed corner of history. Every task is an initiation, whether you consent to it or not. It sounds poetic, maybe even mystical, but modern psychology backs it. When you perform actions without awareness, your brain begins to treat you as an automaton. You slowly lose the sense of being the one who decides, and something else takes over. It starts gently, a soft erosion. You move through your day with that strange feeling that time slipped through your fingers, that the hours vanished behind your back. This is the first sign, subtle, almost polite, that your soul is retreating from the work you do. Ancient Buddhist texts call this the thinning of presence, a moment where you exist, but you are not there. Christian mystics wrote about it too, describing the human being as a lamp whose flame starts to flicker long before it goes dark. And yet, in today's world, we shrug it off as fatigue or distraction. But it's not just that. Something deeper trembles beneath the surface. The body senses the danger first. You'll notice it in the tension that appears out of nowhere, the jaw clenched without your permission, the breath shortened like an animal sensing a storm. Neuroscience calls this a micro-threat response. Tiny stress signals triggered when your inner life is out of alignment with the role you're performing. But ancient myth gives this moment a more haunting name. The moment the guardian departs. As if the spiritual force protecting your inner world quietly steps away when you stop paying attention. When the task becomes mechanical, the self becomes vulnerable. But you keep moving, you keep working. Because the world tells you that this is normal, that this is adulthood, responsibility, survival. And slowly, without drama, you enter the second stage, where the work begins to swallow your perception. You experience what psychologists at Stanford call attentional collapse, a phenomenon where the mind becomes so habituated to routine that it stops questioning, stops observing, stops resisting. Here, routine becomes a kind of spell, a hypnosis. And Steiner warned about this with a severity that still echoes. The unconscious worker is already half possessed. That sounds extreme. Yet when you look around, at families repeating the same patterns, at groups drained by jobs that pay their bills but starve their souls, you begin to see how collective this phenomenon is. It's not just one exhausted individual. It's whole communities sleepwalking through their own labor, shaping a psychic atmosphere heavy enough to bend even the strongest spirits. Work stops being an action and becomes an entity. It demands, it feeds, it grows. This is the moment where the suspense tightens. Because once the collective field forms, you're no longer just dealing with your own exhaustion. You're standing inside a structure, an invisible architecture of expectations, fears, and inherited beliefs. And if you don't know how to protect yourself, it will drain you slowly, the way a shadow drains warmth from a room. This is why ancient traditions insisted on rituals before labor, breathwork, prayer, intention, not superstition, survival, a way to declare, I enter this task consciously, not as prey. And here, almost without noticing, you reach the threshold, the point where awareness becomes your only weapon. Neuroscience calls it metacognitive activation, the ability to observe your own mind while acting. Steiner called it the birth of the free worker, because in this state, you're no longer the object of your labor. You become the subject again, the one who directs, who shapes, who decides. Consciousness becomes a shield. Presence becomes armor. But most people never cross this line. They hover near it, sensing something is wrong but unable to name it. They try to fix the fatigue, the distraction, the emptiness, without understanding the true phenomenon. That work without awareness leads to spiritual atrophy. And the first symptom is the fading of the inner voice. That tiny whisper that once guided you begins to dissolve, and all that remains is the noise of obligation. If you've ever felt that, even once, you already know this truth. Work can be sacred, but only if you remain awake inside it. Otherwise, it becomes a silent thief. And as you already sense the first cracks forming between who you are and what you repeatedly do, the second movement of this silent drama begins to unfold. Slow, invisible, almost polite in the way a storm announces itself long before it breaks. Modern neuroscience has a term for what happens next. Neurological dissociation through patterned overwhelm. It sounds clinical, almost cold, but what it means is that the mind begins to protect itself from monotony by withdrawing. Not fully, just enough for you not to notice the moment you lose yourself. Researchers from Harvard describe it as mind-body divorce, a split so subtle you may live years inside it without realizing you're walking through your life like a ghost wearing your own face. Ancient traditions, of course, knew this long before brain scans confirmed it. The Buddhists called it samvega, the spiritual nausea of recognizing you're living mechanically. Christian mystics warned of the gray hour when the soul moves just a fraction of an inch outside the body. In Greek mythology, it's the moment Theseus forgets the thread Ariadne gave him, wandering the labyrinth not as a hero, but as a man who forgot why he entered. All these stories are pointing to the same psychological erosion that begins when your daily labor turns into a ritual without awareness, and the suspense deepens when you notice the first real alarm bell, the strange sensation of watching yourself from the outside. It can last a second, maybe less, but when it hits, it feels like the world briefly loses its color. Psychologists call this micro-derealization. Steiner would call it something far more dangerous: the loosening of the etheric body, the moment your vital forces begin slipping from the center of your being. You don't collapse, you don't scream, nothing dramatic happens, but something has shifted, like a door left slightly open in a house you thought was locked. From here, the stages begin to escalate. At first, you simply feel tired, the kind of tired sleep doesn't fix. Then you begin to forget things, names, tasks, intentions you had hours ago. And later, when the dissociation becomes a habit, your emotional responses flatten. You stop celebrating the small victories, stop feeling the quiet joys, stop recognizing the inner yes and the inner no. This is the moment neuroscientists classify as the collapse of the reward circuitry. But old wisdom simply says the soul is stepping back because it is not being invited in. What makes this stage truly dangerous is how collective it becomes. Inside workplaces, families, or social circles, one dissociated person affects the others. The atmosphere thickens. A numbness spreads like fog. People mirror each other's exhaustion and call it normal. They justify it. They encourage it. It becomes an unspoken pact. We survive by abandoning ourselves. And before you know it, you're inside a psychological ecosystem designed not for life, but for endurance. These are not individuals anymore. These are groups drifting together, each one deepening the trance of the others. There's a term in group psychology for this: collective attentional shutdown. But Steiner, always more poetic and more ruthless, described it as the death of the inner worker, a phrase that lands like a stone because it implies an ending long before the body stops breathing. When the inner worker dies, the outer worker takes over, the version of you that functions, performs, obeys, but never questions. This is the stage when people begin saying things like, "I don't even know who I am anymore," and they think it's a metaphor. It isn't. Suspense grows here because this is the point where the dissociation might become irreversible if not interrupted. You can feel it, the sense that days blend into weeks without edges, the loss of inner direction, the dull ache behind the eyes that no doctor can explain because the illness is not in the body but in the field surrounding it. Steiner warned that this is when foreign forces enter, not demons in the religious sense, but collective patterns, social shadows, psychological parasites that feed on unconscious repetition. You start working for the work itself, not for your soul. You become a function, not a being. And so the question becomes, how do you protect yourself when your own mind begins abandoning its post? The answer comes from both neuroscience and ancient spiritual science. Awareness must be reestablished through interruption. A pause, a break in the pattern, something so small it seems trivial, but so powerful it cuts through the trance. Even a breath taken consciously is enough to begin calling the soul back into the body. Because once awareness returns, even for a moment, the entire labyrinth changes. You see the walls, you see the exits, you see the thread you forgot you were carrying. But most people never reach that moment of clarity. They keep walking deeper into the maze, unaware that the dissociation has become their new identity. And this is the tragedy. The collapse is silent, incremental, almost gentle. The devastation comes later when you realize you've been missing from your own life for far too long. And just when you think dissociation is the peak of the inner collapse, you begin to feel something heavier pressing against the edges of your chest. It's not fear, not sadness. It's something quieter and far more dangerous. The weight of expectations, those invisible forces that shape your every move long before you dare to question them. Modern psychology describes this as internalized social pressure, a mechanism where the mind bends itself around inherited beliefs, demands, and unspoken rules that were never truly yours. Neuroimaging studies from Cambridge show that when people operate under these pressures, the brain's emotional centers dim as if someone were turning down the lights inside the skull. And that's exactly how it feels. Dimmer, less alive, less you. But this phenomenon is older than science. Ancient traditions warned of it with frightening clarity. In Hindu philosophy, it's the karmic knot. Grant this, a subtle tightening of the inner being caused by living for what others expect, not for what your soul knows. In Christian mysticism, it appears as the yoke of false duty, a heavy burden carried not out of love but out of fear. Greek mythology captured it through Sisyphus, condemned to push not a stone but the weight of a life that never belonged to him. These aren't stories about punishment, they are psychological maps of the moment a person stops being guided by their own consciousness and becomes an instrument of collective expectation. At first, you don't notice the transition. It happens in a breath, in a sigh, in a moment when you say yes because saying no would require explaining yourself. Then it happens again, and again, until your will begins to dissolve, until you're functioning on a script someone else wrote. That is the first stage of this descent. The second is much darker. The body starts warning you, a tightness under the ribs. a fatigue that doesn't match your efforts, a sudden heaviness when you wake up, already tired before the day even begins. Doctors call these psychosomatic signals, but Steiner would call them the inner worker resisting its own burial. Suspense grows slowly here, creeping through ordinary moments. You notice you breathe shallowly when you think of certain tasks. You feel a strange pressure in your temples when someone asks you for something you don't want to give. These are the micro-warnings, the subtle alarms that modern neuroscience maps through cortisol spikes invisible to the naked eye. And yet the ancient wisdom understood it far more poetically. The soul whispers before it screams. Most people ignore the whispers. They dismiss them. They call them mood swings or stress. But these whispers mark the beginning of the energetic deformation that happens when you bend your life around external demands. Soon, the effects spread beyond the individual. Expectations are never personal. They are contagious. Families operate under shared scripts. Workplaces cultivate the atmosphere of obligation like a fog settling in a valley. Entire communities shape themselves around the fear of disappointing invisible authorities. This is what social psychologists call collective role formation, but Steiner describes it as the weaving of the group shadow, a force that gains power precisely because no one questions it. You may think you're carrying only your own burdens, but look closer. Half of what you carry belongs to no one in particular, yet everyone reinforces it. This is where the phenomenon becomes devastating. Because once you begin living through the expectations of others, your inner life no longer expands. It contracts. You lose the ability to feel the natural impulse of your soul. Your decisions become defensive. Your actions become compensatory. Your emotions become tied to a scorecard you never agreed to fill out. And in this shrinking, something begins to twist inside you. Steiner warned that the soul, when forced into a shape that does not fit its nature, begins to fracture. Modern psychology confirms this through research on identity diffusion, a state where the self becomes blurry, inconsistent, unstable. And yet, in this exact darkness, the first opportunity for freedom appears, because the pressure becomes so suffocating that you finally realize this weight is not sacred, it's not destiny, it's not duty, it's a construct, a psychological inheritance passed through generations like a ghost, handed from one hand to another. Awareness becomes a kind of exorcism. The moment you notice how many of your choices are echoes of someone else's fear, the spell begins to break. Not fully, not instantly, but it cracks. And a cracked spell is already dying. But reaching this insight is not gentle. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff inside your own mind. You sense you could fall back into unconscious obedience at any moment, or you could step forward into an unknown space that terrifies you because it requires something radical, reclaiming responsibility for your own soul. The suspense tightens in this moment because you realize how much of your life has been shaped from the outside in. And now, for the first time, the question becomes unavoidable. Who are you when no one is expecting anything from you? Few people dare to answer it honestly. And this is the tragic twist. Those who avoid the question begin the final stage of this phenomenon, where the weight of expectations mutates into a living force, a collective entity pressing down on the psyche. It is no longer merely a psychological pattern. It becomes an atmosphere, a presence, feeding on your silence. And if you've carried the weight of expectations long enough, you eventually enter a territory far darker than fatigue or confusion. It's the point where work itself, the very structure of your daily survival, transforms into something monstrous. Not in a dramatic, supernatural sense, but in a quiet, suffocating way, like a machine that hums softly while swallowing everything placed before it. Modern neuroscience identifies this moment as executive system overload, a collapse in the brain's capacity to regulate emotions, memory, and decision-making. But Steiner would call it by a name that strikes with far more precision: the mechanization of the soul. You've felt this before, even if you never named it. That strange sense that your job is still happening inside you even after you've left the building. The tasks replay themselves in your mind like an echo you can't turn off. You lie down to rest and feel the machine still running through your ribs. What you're sensing is real. Studies from the University of Toronto reveal that work-related images continue firing in the brain long after you stop working, hijacking neural pathways meant for dreaming, creativity, and inner life. It's as if the work refuses to release you, as if it is using you rather than you using it. Ancient mythology mirrors this phenomenon with haunting accuracy. The labyrinth that devoured those who entered, the mills of the giants that required human bodies to turn. Even biblical stories of bondage describe more than physical chains. They describe psychological structures that demand obedience long after the chains are gone. These myths are not metaphors. They are warnings written in symbolic form about what happens when work loses its spirit. It becomes a consuming force. At first, the signs appear in small, unsettling ways. You begin to notice your breath growing shallow around certain people or tasks. Your stomach tightens when you see a specific notification. You feel a strange pressure in your chest as if someone pressed a heavy book against your heart. These are not random symptoms. They are the early tremors of burnout's first stage, what psychologists call emotional pre-collapse. But the suspense deepens because most people ignore this stage. They tell themselves they're being dramatic. They push harder, and the machine grows hungrier. Soon, your sleep becomes fragmented. Your dreams are replaced by unfinished obligations. You wake up with clenched fists. You lose track of days because every day feels identical. Here, the ancient mystics would say the inner fire, the warmth that makes a human being truly alive, begins to dim. Steiner insisted that when a task is performed without inner participation, the human etheric body weakens, allowing external forces to dominate the psyche. Not demons, not spirits, but collective currents of exhaustion that pass from one worker to another, like a virus woven from despair. This is when the phenomenon becomes collective. A workplace filled with this atmosphere becomes a feeding ground for fatigue. People walk in already drained. Families absorb the residue of someone's exhaustion and pass it along unconsciously. Even children feel it, sensing the heaviness in adults' voices, learning to associate work not with meaning, but with depletion. Social psychologists call this emotional contagion, but Steiner would give it a more chilling name: the shadow that learns to walk. The moment exhaustion becomes a being of its own, shaping group behavior without a sound. And here is the deepest stage, when the machine no longer needs to pressure you because you've internalized its demands. You criticize yourself before anyone else does. You speed up even when no one is watching. You apologize for resting. You feel guilty for breathing out too slowly. At this point, you're no longer inside the machine is inside you. This is what neuroscientists describe as self-exploitation circuitry, but ancient wisdom names it far more bluntly: self-betrayal. Suspense tightens because people rarely notice this transformation. They think it's discipline, responsibility, professionalism. They don't realize they have become instruments of a system that doesn't even know their names, a system that consumes them without malice simply because it was built to function, not to care. This is the tragedy of modern labor. The machine is not evil, it's empty. And emptiness, when given power, behaves like a void. It pulls everything into itself. But even in this darkness, there is a point of intervention, a protocol of protection born from both psychology and Steiner's spiritual science. It begins with what modern researchers call strategic disengagement, but what ancient texts describe as stepping back into yourself, a withdrawal not out of fear but out of sovereignty. You learn to interrupt the machine, to reclaim a moment before beginning a task, to breathe in a way that reminds your body that it belongs to you, not to the work. It may sound fragile, but it is the beginning of liberation, because protection does not come from avoiding work. It comes from refusing to let work devour the inner worker. Consciousness becomes a shield, intention becomes armor, and even the smallest act of awareness becomes an act of rebellion against the machine that tried to swallow you whole. And once the machine has shaped your rhythms and drained your inner fire, something even more subtle begins to form around you, something you cannot see, yet you feel it every time you wake up with the sense that your day has already begun without you. It's the strange phenomenon where work starts to move on its own, guided not by intention, but by repetition. Neuroscientists studying behavioral loops call this habitual neural automation, but ancient wisdom described it with a far more haunting precision: the creation of an energetic entity built from collective repetition. In modern terms, psychologists would call it a group pattern. In esoteric language, Steiner would call it an egregora, a force born from the thoughts and behaviors of many people acting unconsciously. At first, these forces feel like routines, familiar, predictable, almost comforting in the way a ritual gives structure to chaos. But slowly, they begin to pull you. They shape your mood before you're aware of it. They make you tense before a meeting even begins. They make you rush even when there's no reason to hurry. They push you into the same emotional reactions as everyone around you, as if you're moving inside someone else's atmosphere. Harvard studies on group psychology show that when people share environments of stress, their brainwaves begin to synchronize, quite literally aligning into similar patterns of vigilance, exhaustion, and compliance. And that's where the danger hides. Once synchronized, you stop being an individual consciousness and become part of a collective momentum. This is when the suspense begins to thicken. You notice moments where your body reacts before your mind does. Your hands shift toward your phone without intention. Your breath shortens when you enter certain rooms. You speak in ways that don't sound like you. Phrases borrowed from the group, tones shaped by the environment. These are the early signs that the collective field is working through you. In mythology, this is the moment when people spoke of gods possessing mortals or spirits influencing tribes. Today, we call it emotional contagion, social entrainment, mirror neuron resonance. But whatever name you give it, the truth is the same. Something larger than you begins to work through you. Families are especially vulnerable to this. A single stressed worker carries their exhaustion home like an invisible cloud. Children absorb it. Partners mirror it, and soon the entire household breathes in the same rhythm of tension. The atmosphere becomes a living thing, tired, hungry, irritable. Social researchers describe this phenomenon as collective mood architecture, and it explains why entire families crumble under the same pressure, even if only one member works the stressful job. Because the job is not contained in the workplace, the job is in the field, and the field follows you. Workplaces magnify this effect tenfold. A group of individuals repeating the same tasks, worrying about the same deadlines, fearing the same consequences. This is enough to generate an egregora strong enough to override the emotional states of those who enter. You walk into a room and feel tired, even if you woke up energized. You sit at your desk and feel anxious before anything has happened. These feelings don't belong to you. They belong to the collective entity fed by the endless repetition of unconscious labor. And yet, because you have no name for it, you assume it's your own mind collapsing again. This is the turning point, because once the group field becomes stronger than your individual presence, your autonomy begins to erode. You say yes without wanting to. You fix problems that aren't yours. You carry guilt for things you never caused. You begin to feel responsible for maintaining the emotional balance of the group, as if the energy of the egregora were breathing through your ribs. In Steiner's spiritual science, this is the moment the human being loses their spiritual sovereignty. In modern psychology, it is known as role fusion, the collapse of the boundary between the self and the environment. And here, the phenomenon becomes devastating, because an entity born from repetition has one goal: to perpetuate itself. It pushes you to repeat the same actions, the same reactions, the same emotional states. Even when you want to break the cycle, something invisible pulls you back. You feel it as dread when you think of quitting, guilt when you imagine resting, anxiety when you consider changing your routines. These emotions aren't yours. They are survival mechanisms of the collective force you've been feeding. But there is a protocol of protection, one known intuitively by ancient monks, shamans, and initiates long before modern science rediscovered it. The first step is interrupting the rhythm. Even a 2-second conscious breath severs the automatic loop. Neuroscience confirms this. Awareness reactivates the prefrontal cortex, breaking the grip of habit circuits. But ancient wisdom describes it more poetically. The soul steps back into the throne. The second step is reclaiming inner authority through intention. Not positive affirmations or shallow motivation, but a deep declaration of sovereignty. I choose my next action. When spoken or felt consciously, it breaks the influence of the egregora like a blade cutting through fog. And the final step is recognition. The moment you truly see that a collective influence was shaping your thoughts, you're no longer inside it blindly. The shadow loses its advantage. The spell weakens, because awareness, as Steiner insisted, is the only force that uncreates what unconscious repetition has built. And if the egregora of unconscious work has already begun feeding on your rhythms, what follows next is not sudden or explosive. It is quiet, almost gentle, the way a rope slowly frays before finally snapping. This stage begins with a subtle crack inside the self, a break so small you can live months without noticing it. Psychologists call it identity fragmentation, the dispersal of the inner core caused by prolonged misalignment. But Steiner, with his razor-sharp clarity, described it in far more unsettling terms: the fall of the inner worker. The moment when the being who acts, chooses, thinks, and creates begins to withdraw from the human shell that once housed it. At this point, the symptoms are still soft enough to be dismissed. You feel a vague sense of disappointment toward yourself, though you cannot say why. You begin apologizing for things that don't matter. You hesitate before speaking, as if your voice must earn permission to exist. You look in the mirror and feel slightly misaligned with your own reflection. These are microfractures, early signals of inner collapse. Neuroscientists see this in fMRI scans as a weakening of the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with self-definition. But ancient wisdom saw it as the dimming of the inner flame, the quiet moment when the soul begins pulling its energy inward to protect itself. Then comes guilt. Strange, irrational, misplaced guilt. Guilt for resting, guilt for slowing down, guilt for not performing at superhuman levels. This isn't personal emotion, it is a symptom of the fracture deepening. The psyche starts blaming itself for the exhaustion that the collective has inflicted. It becomes the perfect servant, obedient, ashamed, compliant. This is the point where people begin saying things like, "I should be stronger," or "I'm failing," or "everyone else seems to manage." They believe these thoughts are self-generated, but they're echoes, reflections of the group's expectations that have threaded themselves into their internal monologue. Suspense rises here because the transformation accelerates without warning. The fragmentation worsens. You forget what brings you joy, you lose your natural rhythm. Emotionally, you oscillate between numbness and sudden, disproportionate waves of sadness or irritation. Psychologists label this as emotional dysregulation, a collapse of the internal compass. But Steiner would say something chilling. The astral body begins drifting, meaning your emotional identity detaches slightly from your physical presence. You're still functioning, still speaking, still working, but the one who feels is standing somewhere behind you. This is when life begins to blur. Days merge. Your memories lose their warmth. You perform tasks automatically, yet each action leaves you more hollow than before. The ancient Buddhists describe the stage with the stark expression, dying before dying, the moment a person remains biologically alive, but spiritually suspended. Modern researchers see the same pattern in chronic burnout. The energy of the self retracts like a frightened animal hiding in the darkest corner of the mind. Families, too, feel this fracture. The fragmented person becomes unpredictable. sometimes distant, sometimes overly accommodating, sometimes irritable for reasons they can't name. Loved ones sense something is wrong but cannot locate the wound. Children become cautious. Partners become confused. And a strange silence forms around the individual, like the hush in a room that knows something fragile is breaking. This is what social psychologists call relational dissonance, but Steiner described it with poetic brutality. The soul's cry is heard only by those who have not yet lost their own. As the fragmentation deepens, the body begins reacting. Your posture collapses, as if the spine can no longer carry the invisible weight. Your breath becomes shallow. Your heartbeat grows irregular during moments of stress. Doctors may diagnose anxiety or fatigue, but these symptoms are not merely physical. They are signs that the inner worker is no longer aligned with the outer life. The human being becomes two beings layered awkwardly together, the one who performs and the one who watches helplessly from within. And yet, within this darkness, a stage of eerie clarity appears. When the fracture is almost complete, something inside you begins to whisper, not with panic, but with truth. It's the faint awareness that you are disappearing inside your own life. Modern psychology calls this insight a metacognitive jolt, an awakening triggered by crisis. But ancient wisdom regarded it as the soul knocking from the inside, asking to be let back into the world. This is the moment where a protocol of protection becomes not optional but essential. The first step is painfully simple. Stop the internal blaming, because guilt is the glue that keeps the fracture in place. The second step is to name what is happening, to acknowledge aloud or in thought. This is not just exhaustion. This is fragmentation. Naming the shadow makes it tangible, and what is tangible can be confronted. The third step, the most vital, is what Steiner called the return to the inner center. Sitting in silence, breathing consciously, reclaiming even a millimeter of presence inside your own body. These tiny acts are not symbolic. They are lifelines thrown into a collapsing inner structure. For the truth is harsh, but liberating. The fragmentation is not your failure. It is the inevitable consequence of living too long in a world that rewards unconsciousness and punishes presence. And yet the soul, even when cornered and wounded, waits, always, for the moment you turn inward again. And once the inner worker has fractured and begun its slow retreat, something unexpected happens. A shift so subtle it feels like the faint click of a lock inside the mind. It's the moment where the collapse reaches its deepest point and, paradoxically, creates the first real opening for transformation. Neuroscientists call this point cognitive reorientation, a brief interval where the brain becomes malleable again after prolonged stress, almost like the quiet breath the mind takes before reorganizing itself. But Steiner saw it from a deeper vantage point. This is the moment when consciousness, if invited, becomes the only possible weapon against the forces that have hollowed you out. It often begins with a single, disorienting realization, something small, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I'm not here. You might be sitting in front of your computer, in a meeting, on a bus, washing dishes, staring at a wall, but suddenly you feel it, the void where your presence should be. And instead of collapsing further, something inside you flinches, as if startled awake. Psychologists describe this as a metacognitive spark, a moment when the observing self breaks through layers of numbness. Esoteric traditions describe it as the soul touching the edges of the body again. Suspense rises because this moment feels unstable, like waking up in a burning room. You realize how long you've been unconscious, how far you've drifted, how deeply the machine and the collective shadow have shaped your actions, your voice, even your thoughts. And the fear that follows is not dramatic. It is cold, disquieting, focused. What have I become while I wasn't here? That question is the doorway. It is terrifying because it is honest. This is where the role of consciousness changes entirely. Up until now, it was something you occasionally experienced, during moments of rest, moments of inspiration, moments of rebellion. But now, consciousness becomes a survival mechanism. Modern research shows that when people activate the prefrontal cortex deliberately, through breath, awareness, or intentional reflection, the stress circuits lose their dominance. In ancient language, the inner warrior stands back up. Steiner insisted that, at this stage, consciousness is not just awareness, it is command. It reorganizes the inner world the way a shepherd gathers scattered sheep. The first task, surprisingly, is not to fight the exhaustion or the fragmentation, it's to witness it, to see the damage without turning away. Most people fail here because looking inward after months or years of unconscious labor feels like opening a room you've neglected for decades. Dust everywhere, broken furniture, the ghost of who you used to be sitting silently in the corner. But if you can look, truly look without judgment, something extraordinary begins to shift. Awareness pulls scattered pieces of identity back toward the center. The mind stops spinning in panic. The emotional body stops fleeing. The self begins to reform, molecule by molecule. Then comes the second stage, reclaiming your internal position. This is what Steiner called standing vertically in the soul. It means acting from inside yourself again, rather than reacting to the demands outside. Neuroscientists now understand this as metacognitive regulation, your ability to think about what you're thinking, to choose your next move instead of letting instinct or habit choose for you. It's subtle but profound. You breathe differently. You speak slower. You answer questions with intention instead of reflex. Even your posture shifts, signaling to the nervous system that authority has returned to the throne. But this reorganization is not peaceful. It triggers resistance from every force that benefited from your unconsciousness. The habits, the collective pressures, the expectations, the egregoras fed by your repeating patterns. This is the moment ancient myths depict as the hero's confrontation with the monster in the cave. The monster is not external. It is internal momentum. Everything you repeated without awareness, now pressing you to repeat it again. Suspense here is not narrative, it is biological. Your body trembles, your emotions oscillate. You feel like you're fighting something invisible because you are. And this is where the protocol of protection becomes essential. Modern psychologists call it cognitive anchoring, but Steiner framed it with far more gravity. Consciousness must become a shield, not a soft glow of mindfulness, but a sharp, deliberate presence that slices through automatic reactions. When you breathe consciously before speaking, you interrupt the collective field. When you choose your next task instead of being dragged to it, you reclaim territory. When you withdraw from environments that devour your energy, you perform what Steiner called a strategic retreat. Not cowardice, but sovereignty. This is not enlightenment, it is survival. Slowly, astonishingly, the field around you begins to shift. People speak to you differently. They sense something they can't name. You're no longer synchronized with the group fatigue. You no longer mirror the expectations that once consumed you. Even your silence feels different, denser, calmer, less penetrable. This is what ancient traditions called the return of the inner king, when the true self once again occupies the center of the being, and everything external must rearrange itself accordingly. And yet, the deepest part of this transformation is not strength, it is clarity. You begin to see, with unsettling precision, which parts of your life were never truly yours. You notice tasks that drain you because they were born from fear, not purpose. You notice obligations that collapse the moment you question them. You notice patterns that lose power the exact second you stop feeding them with unconscious attention. This moment, this shift from survival to clarity, is the true turning point. It is where you stop being a victim of the machine and begin becoming something the machine cannot touch. And then, something shifts, quietly, almost imperceptibly, when consciousness finally regains its seat inside you. It isn't dramatic. There is no blinding revelation or triumphant music. Instead, it feels like a thin beam of light entering a room that has been dark for far too long. A sense of inner space, a breath that reaches deeper than usual, a small but unmistakable spark of strength flickering inside a body that had forgotten what strength felt like. This is the moment when the energy you use to give away automatically begins to return. Neuroscientists call this intrinsic motivation reactivation, a reawakening of the brain's dopamine pathways once numbed by routine and exhaustion. But ancient esoteric wisdom knew this moment well. The rise of the creative force, the return of the inner craftsman, the rebirth of the will. At first, it feels fragile, almost tender, a desire to create something small. A sudden curiosity about a task you once hated. The faint memory that you once had preferences, impulses, personal rhythms. This tender spark is sacred. It is the soul remembering itself. Steiner described it as the quiet resurrection of the spiritual will, a force that does not shout or demand but simply stands and breathes. When this will begins to stir, even slightly, the entire architecture of your inner life begins to shift. You no longer move, only in reaction to pressure. You begin moving from within. Suspense deepens here because the old forces, the machine, the collective expectations, the unconscious rhythms, sense this shift and begin to push back. They don't want you awake. You may feel sudden waves of fatigue, irrational doubts, intrusive thoughts, or a strange emptiness that tells you this isn't worth it. These are not failures. They are the dying reflexes of patterns that once controlled you. Modern psychology sees this as habit extinction resistance, but ancient traditions described it more accurately, the shadow resisting the return of the fire. But if you stay present, if you continue breathing consciously, acting deliberately, choosing intentionally, something extraordinary begins to happen. The tasks that once drained you become pathways for meaning. The work that once felt imprisoning begins to reveal hidden structure. The routines that once suffocated you soften at the edges. Why? Because you are no longer approaching them as an empty vessel. You are approaching them as a creator. This is the heart of Steiner's spiritual view of labor. The alchemy of transforming a task into a mission, not by changing the task, but by changing the one who performs it. Neuroscience supports this profoundly. When a person acts from intrinsic motivation, even simple tasks activate regions associated with mastery, creativity, and emotional regulation. The brain becomes a sculptor again, shaping the world rather than being shaped by it. In esoteric language, the inner worker begins to reclaim the tools of destiny. At this stage, you start noticing small but powerful shifts. You speak more clearly. You pause before reacting. You notice beauty in moments that used to feel mechanical. You create micro-rituals that anchor your awareness. A breath before beginning, a moment of gratitude, an intentional placement of your hands, a deliberate decision to focus rather than drift. These tiny acts accumulate, forming what psychologists call positive identity consolidation, but what spiritual traditions call the weaving of the inner temple. Because when consciousness enters the smallest action, even washing a cup becomes an act of alignment. Even writing an email becomes an expression of intention. Even routine work becomes a quiet form of devotion, not to the system, not to the machine, not to expectation, but to the self that has returned after being absent for so long. And as this inner transformation unfolds, its effects spread outward. The collective field that once drained you begins to shift in your presence. People become calmer around you. Some become intimidated. Others become inspired. A few become uncomfortable because your awareness disrupts the patterns they rely on. But regardless of their reaction, the field changes. That is the power of consciousness. Its presence reorganizes environments without speaking a word. This is when you begin to feel something like purpose. Not a grand calling or dramatic destiny, but a subtle alignment. Work stops being an enemy and begins revealing itself as a mirror. Every task becomes an opportunity to observe yourself, to strengthen your presence, to refine your will. In ancient teachings, this is the point where the worker becomes the initiate, one who transforms the external world by transforming their inner world first. And then comes the most profound shift of all, the moment you feel a growing sense of coherence inside you, as if all the scattered parts are finally moving in the same direction. Psychologists call this self-congruence, but Steiner framed it with more gravity, the rebirth of the spiritual mission. It is not about career. It is not about ambition. It is the recognition that your work, whatever form it takes, is a stage for the evolution of your being, not a prison, but a pathway. And with this realization, something inside you settles, not into complacency, but into clarity. You understand that the machine cannot control someone who acts consciously. The collective field cannot dominate someone who carries their own presence. Repetition cannot hollow out someone who infuses intention into every movement. This is the quiet beginning of freedom, not the external kind, but the inner kind, the only kind that lasts. And once the creative force begins to return, quiet, steady, determined, you step into the stage that most people never reach in their working lives. It is the moment when labor ceases to be a weight and becomes a pact, not with the system, not with society, but with something deeper inside you, a vow, a subtle alignment, a recognition that the way you work shapes not only your destiny, but the very architecture of your inner life. Modern psychology calls this values-based engagement, the point where your actions align with your core identity. But Steiner went far beyond this surface understanding. He said that when your soul re-enters your work, you're not merely performing tasks. You are participating in a spiritual economy, a circulation of meaning that nourishes the invisible world as much as the physical one. This stage begins with a strange sensation, something both grounding and unsettling, the feeling that you are finally choosing, not reacting, not obeying, choosing. Even when the tasks remain the same, even when the environment hasn't changed, the inner experience shifts dramatically. Every movement feels deliberate. Every gesture carries a texture of intention. Your presence becomes thicker, more tangible, and because of this, the work you do begins to vibrate differently in your hands, as if your consciousness were imprinting itself onto each action. In neuroscience, this is reflected in the activation of networks associated with mastery and purpose. In esoteric terms, this is the return of the spiritual craftsman, the human being as co-creator instead of servant. Suspense grows here not because of danger, but because of responsibility. You begin to sense that purpose is not something waiting for you at the end of a long road. It's something that emerges from how you choose to walk each step. And that realization is heavy, sacred, almost intimidating, because purpose is no longer a fantasy, an external dream used to escape life. It becomes something more real, the weight of knowing that your inner life shapes your outer world with every silent decision. Ancient myths describe this stage through the archetype of the warrior who serves a higher order. Not a king, not a nation, but a principle. The Japanese samurai called it jai, the righteousness of aligning action with inner truth. Early Christian mystics described it as working in the presence of the divine, where every mundane task becomes a form of prayer. And Steiner, always precise, said that when a person works with consciousness, the spiritual world bends its attention toward them. But this pact, this sacred mode of working, demands something in return, the death of false labor. You begin noticing tasks you cannot perform unconsciously anymore, people you cannot obey automatically, environments you cannot enter without losing pieces of yourself. The clarity you gain becomes a compass that refuses to let you betray yourself again. This creates tension. Some people around you sense the shift and admire it. Others feel threatened because your presence exposes their sleep. And a few try to pull you back into the old patterns because your transformation makes them confront their own stagnation. This is where the pact becomes a test. The collective shadows try to reclaim you. Old habits whisper, doubts reappear, not because you're failing, but because you're changing. Psychologists describe this as identity stabilization resistance, but ancient texts understood it as the final temptation, the last attempt of the old self to cling to its familiar suffering. You feel a pull backward, but for the first time, you also feel a pull forward, a direction, a sense that your life is no longer dissolving toward emptiness, but organizing itself toward something meaningful. And then, gradually, the work itself begins to feel different. It stops draining you. It begins feeding you, not with excitement or adrenaline, but with coherence. You start experiencing what researchers call flow resonance, where your actions align with your internal rhythm. But on the spiritual level, something far more profound is happening. Your tasks become expressions of your being rather than substitutes for it. Your presence fuels the work, and the work strengthens your presence. It becomes reciprocal, alive, symbiotic. This reciprocity is the essence of the pact. You are no longer working for survival alone. You are working in service to your own evolution. Each task becomes a sharpening of will. Each gesture, an expansion of awareness. Each challenge, a refinement of your spiritual armor. And ironically, this inner transformation begins to affect the outer world. People trust you more. They come to you for clarity. They feel grounded in your presence without knowing why. Your actions generate ripples that move far beyond the task you're doing. In esoteric language, this is when the human being becomes a column, someone whose inner alignment stabilizes the space around them. You anchor your environment simply by existing consciously within it. You carry a quiet authority that does not need to be announced. And in this authority, you begin to sense that your work, whatever its form, has become a bridge between the visible and the invisible, the mundane and the sacred. And just when this realization begins to feel empowering, it also becomes somber, because you understand the truth behind the pact, that conscious work demands the death of the smaller self, the one who lived through fear, obligation, and expectation. The pact is not about ambition. It is about surrender. Not surrender to the world, but surrender to the higher version of yourself that refuses to let you shrink back into unconsciousness. This is the climax philosophico of the pact, the moment when you realize that your work is no longer just labor. It is a vow whispered silently between you and the destiny you are finally willing to inhabit. And when the pact is sealed, not through words, but through the quiet precision of how you now move through your days, you reach the final stage of this long, invisible journey. A stage so subtle, most people never recognize they've arrived because nothing around them looks different. The same work, the same responsibilities, the same world. But inside, a fundamental shift has taken place. A shift that ancient traditions described with a single image, the human being becoming a temple, not metaphorically, not poetically, but structurally, as if your inner world had reorganized itself into a sanctuary where consciousness stands guard at every threshold. It begins with presence, dense, grounded, unmistakable. You walk into a room, and you don't dissolve into the collective atmosphere anymore. You stand as yourself, no matter who's there. You speak without shrinking your voice. You listen without being pulled into emotional currents that aren't yours. This is not confidence. It is coherence. Neuroscientists studying advanced meditative states call it sustained prefrontal integration, where awareness remains stable even under pressure. But spiritual science frames it with more gravity. The soul is fully inside the body again. And the world reacts to this in a way that feels almost supernatural. People lower their voices when you pass. Conversations shift subtly in your presence. Some individuals become calmer, others become agitated, as if your very existence disrupts the unconscious patterns they cling to. You begin to realize you're no longer absorbing the field. You're shaping it, not through force, not through intention, but through the silent fact of being present in a world where most people are absent from themselves. Suspense deepens here because this power is not flashy. It is quiet, sober, almost eerie in its subtlety. You notice synchronicities, small ones at first, then larger ones. Tasks unfold more smoothly. Opportunities appear that previously seemed out of reach. You find yourself saying no without guilt, yes without hesitation, leaving places without fear, entering new spaces without shrinking. It's as if the world begins rearranging itself around the architecture you've built inside. And yet, the greatest transformation is not external. It is the way you relate to your own work. You no longer see labor as something happening to you. It becomes something that flows through you. You infuse intention into tasks the way a sculptor infuses form into stone. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is unconscious. Even mistakes become part of a larger rhythm. What psychologists call adaptive self-regulation, Steiner described far more elegantly. To work consciously is to breathe with the universe. In this stage, your actions acquire weight, not heaviness, but significance. You sense the energy behind every movement. You feel the alignment or misalignment before you act. You choose tasks not by obligation, but by inner resonance. And if a duty arises that does not resonate, you approach it with awareness, transforming it through intention instead of letting it diminish you. This is the essence of sacred labor, not changing what you do, but changing the being who does it. But this newfound clarity carries a somber edge, because once you stand fully inside yourself, you can no longer lie to yourself. You cannot pretend you don't know what drains you. You cannot ignore environments that deform your inner structure. You cannot betray your own rhythm without feeling the wound immediately. In this sense, consciousness is both a liberation and a burden. You gain freedom, but you also gain responsibility, first to yourself, then to whatever forces your presence influences, and slowly you begin to understand something that was invisible to you before. Your work is not separate from your spirituality, it is your spirituality. Every gesture, every decision, every micro-action becomes part of the architecture of your soul. The mundane becomes ritual, the ordinary becomes sacred, and the life you once sleepwalked through begins to feel like a landscape you can shape with the slightest movement of intention. This is when the ancient idea of the inner temple reveals its true meaning. It is not a metaphor for peace. It is a structure built through discipline, awareness, and 1,000 small acts of presence. And once this temple is built, something extraordinary happens. External chaos can no longer enter without your permission. You feel disturbances from the outside world, but they no longer become part of you. You experience pressure, but it does not define you. You witness the exhaustion of others, but you do not drown in it. You have become a threshold, someone through whom the world passes but does not conquer. And in the final, most somber realization, you understand the secret Steiner spoke of again and again. The world does not change when you work harder. It changes when you work consciously, because consciousness alters the field, the patterns, the collective forces that once fed on your absence. It breaks generational cycles. It rewrites internal scripts. It transforms work from a mechanism of survival into a vehicle of evolution. And then, quietly, without fanfare, you realize something astonishing. You have become the calm in the storm, the flame in the machine, the presence that bends the invisible world, the temple that walks, the worker who is finally awake. And once you see this, truly see it, you also understand the shadow that lingers behind the revelation. You can never go back to unconsciousness without feeling yourself slowly disintegrate again. The echo of this truth follows you everywhere, not as a threat, but as a reminder. This is the final echo, the somber closing of the journey. To work consciously is to carry your soul in your hands every day, and to know that dropping it would break you more than any labor ever could.